Monkeyboy's YouTube channel is stance independently and intersubjectively the best YouTube channel. Subscribe. I'm talking from the heart.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. So I guess my question was, what is the argument that the Christian God exists?
The argument that the Christian God exists is a transcendental argument. If X, therefore Y, X, therefore Y. Wait a minute. Let me try to formulate it because man, my mind was on something else. For X to be the case, Y must be the case. X is the case, therefore Y is the case. So we use X as representing any fact of experience like the world, the existence of the universe, and we say for that to be the case, Y must be the case because Y is the precondition for X and Y represents God and X is the case, therefore Y. So because we have reality, we have existence, that points to God because God is the precondition for these things existing. That is the argument. Sure. But let me try to finish. What is the argument for premise one? The argument for premise one is not an argument, it is a demonstration that if you reject the Christian God, then experience becomes unintelligible. And that's easily demonstrated.
Okay, so I wanted to, a quick clarification. By the way, that was a good presentation of the argument. A quick clarification question. Is Y, you said Y is the variable Y, is that substituted with God or the Christian God?
The Christian God.
Okay, that's fair. And yeah, so then you said your argument for one was something like, if the Christian God doesn't exist or something like that, then experience would be unintelligible.
Yeah.
What is the argument for that?
The demonstration. There's no argument. There's no argument. There's demonstration.
Okay, what's the difference between demonstration and argument? Maybe because I might not be following.
A demonstration is something that you can actually see and experience. An argument is a conclusion that has premises supporting it.
Okay, so in other words, you're saying you have no argument that the Christian God, you have no argument that if the Christian God doesn't exist, experience would be unintelligible. You have no argument, but you have a demonstration.
No argument, just demonstration.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is I want to make sure I follow this idea of a demonstration. Is the demonstration supposed to show me that the premise is true?
Yeah, it would.
Okay, so how about this? How would you show me that that premise is true? Maybe we can try that.
Okay, big example. When you study philosophy under the rubric of axiology, you learn about moral principles. You learn about deontology, virtue ethics, and utilitarianism, and you learn about divine command theory. Every theory or every moral theory within philosophy is subjective or a subjective framework, except for, and this is conceptually speaking, divine command theory, in that if God exists, or if it is true that God exists, then his commands would be objective and universal, whereas every other perspective, conceptually speaking, would be subjective to the culture or to the individual. So one of the facts of experience is that we all have inherent moral values, inherent moral principles, and we recognize that there are certain things in the universe that are just objectively wrong, and they are generally agreed upon by most human beings because they are universal moral principles. If God does not exist, then objective morals do not exist. But the very fact that we try to propose objective morals points to the existence of God, and it becomes unintelligible or makes no sense when we reject his existence and then speak about objective morality being the case or being true. So that's just one example.
So what do you mean by unintelligible? By unintelligible, do you mean something like contradictory, like logically contradictory, or do you mean something else?
No explanatory power that would make it coherent or logical that these things are the case without a grounding. So I could use an example. It makes no sense to say that objective moral principles exist, but there is no grounding for those objective universal principles.
Okay, so I want to take a step back for a second. The original premise in the tag argument, it was something like, so the Christian God is the necessary precondition for something. What was that thing that you said is the necessary precondition for? I might have forgotten.
Existence and reality, which would encompass every fact of existence. So God would be the fact that grounds all other facts.
So then maybe we can put this might be a better lane to have the conversation in. So you're trying to say something like it's impossible for anything to exist if the Christian God doesn't exist.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yes.
Okay, then let's just say it might be easier just to take this conversation into the lane of just objects existing, and let's say in that specific avenue. How would you quote unquote demonstrate? Use the word demonstrate. How would you demonstrate that it's impossible for any object to exist if the Christian God doesn't exist?
I don't know how I would be able to demonstrate that. It will just be an argument that I give and say that God is the precondition for these things existing. And the reason why he is the precondition is because we see instances of consciousness, rationality, and logic in the universe. And that can only point to a conscious, rational, logical being, and that would be God. But the alternative would be a naturalistic entity or no entity, which would not make sense.
Yeah, I wanted to say real quick. So I wanted to flag one thing. One thing is it seemed like what you just said is kind of like a teleological argument. And I don't think those arguments don't actually show that it's impossible for objects to exist without God. But and then going back, another point I wanted to make is that, so you said you don't know how you would demonstrate it. So let me make sure I'm following. You're saying you don't have an argument and you don't know how you would demonstrate it. Is that correct? Or?
No, I'm saying I don't have an argument, and the demonstration is found in the fact that as we observe the universe, as we look at the world, and we see its exemplification, it obviously shows ultimate design and intentionality, and this points to an ultimate intentional designer, which would be the precondition for these things existing. Because if this precondition didn't exist, none of these things would exist.
Yeah, so I want to say two things real quick. Sorry, the reason I said that is because I might have misheard you, but I thought earlier you said I don't know how I would demonstrate it. Maybe I misheard you. So yeah, to talk about your design argument. So even if that design argument works, even if we see some design in art in the universe that's evidence for theism or something, I still want to flag that that's actually not enough to show premise one is true. Because remember, premise one is saying that these objects couldn't, or it's impossible. It's not possible for these objects to exist without the Christian God. But all you've shown with the design argument is that these objects have a designer that doesn't necessarily even have to be the Christian God. And even if they have a designer, it doesn't show that it's impossible for them to exist without the designer.
So which other God has the same attributes that the Christian God has?
No, I agree. Only the Christian God has the attributes the Christian God has. That's a kind of triviality. But I'm saying the design argument, all it shows is that at best, there is a designer for the universe. And even if that's true, it doesn't show that the designer is the Christian God. That's the first point. And
I would say it does because of the attributes of the Christian God that no other God has. It has to be the Christian God.
Think about it. A designer could just be a rational agent who is powerful to some degree, but not all powerful, who is knowing to some degree, but not all knowing. So you could actually have a designer that doesn't have the attributes of the Christian God. And secondly, no. Well, yes, and then secondly, even if you did show it, right? Even if you did, you still have to show that it's not possible. You still have to show, all you would have shown is that these objects were created by this designer. But what you wouldn't have shown is that it's impossible for the objects to exist without the designer.
I disagree that you could point to an entity that is to some degree powerful, to some degree all-knowing, and to some degree a designer. Because that entity that you're making reference to, there's no way of knowing that entity because there would be no propositional revelation showing you that entity.
That's different. But but you see how you said even if that were true, which that's going from the metaphysical question of whether or not this being has that properties to the epistemic question of how we would know it has those properties, or how we would even know it exists.
Let me rephrase. It is impossible for that being to exist because there is no revelation about that being. It doesn't exist.
Okay, so let's just say this. So I think we both agree. So we both agree though that in order for this to be a justification for V1, we both agree you'd have to show that only the Christian God could be the designer, and we both agree that you would have to show that furthermore that it's also impossible for these objects to exist without the Christian God, right? We both agree with that? Just in order for you to justify P1.
Before we continue, I want to know what I'm arguing against, because I don't know your worldview. I don't know what your positions are on these things. Are you an atheist?
I would say I'm more of an agnostic. And by the way, I'm not offering a party. I'm just more so interested in your argument for the first premise. So I'm not necessarily offering a worldview here to talk about.
And as an agnostic, in your worldview, what is your position on whether or not we have an ultimate, single, defensible, unifying causal principle that actualizes, sustains, and controls the world? What is your position on that? Is there something that does this, or aren't there?
Okay. Yeah, and real quick, and before I answer that, I want to make sure, are we moving away from tag and we're going to my view? We can do that if you want. Are we just moving away from tag?
No, I just want to know, because by knowing what your position is, I can know if your attempt at refuting my worldview also refutes your worldview. Because a lot of
okay. I mean, I'm
times
fine if you want to.
without-
I'm fine if you want to ask about my view. So, like, about a cause. So,
It's
I'll
just
say
one,
about your
one question. I just want to know one.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So, as I understand your question was, is there a single like causal principle that like secures everything, that is like the ground of all of reality or something? Was that the sort of question?
There's one part of the question that's missing. Yes, that is the question, but here's the part that's missing. Is there a single identifiable, in your worldview, a single identifiable unifying causal principle that does?
Okay, and I'm going to make the assumption that by causal principle you mean a kind of like object or an entity or a force or whatever. I'm
that
going to
grounds
assume
everything.
Yeah. No, there's nothing like that on my view.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure. Okay. Go ahead.
So I wanted to sort of get back to this issue with the first premise. So I think we're at the point where the first premise is, okay, he's the necessary condition for any object to exist. No object even could exist without the Christian God.
That's right.
And then your argument or your demonstration, whatever you want to say, was you gave a kind of design argument. You say we see rationality, we see intelligence in the universe, and so therefore the universe was a design. And here's my problem with that argument. My critique is that it seems like you'd have to show more to support the premise. First, you'd have to show first that the designer would have to be the Christian God. And then second, you'd have to show that those objects that the Christian God designed, they couldn't have existed without him designing them. So you have to show those two as well to even kind of meet the bar of supporting the first premise.
Okay, so the first one would be the Christian God has an attribute set that is unique and that no other God possesses. And this attribute set would be the attributes that would have sufficient grounds to explain every aspect of existence. And because we see those aspects in existence that portray these attributes of the Christian God, they point to his existence. So as I look at the world, I see the world pointing to the existence of God. But somebody else looks at the world and say that it points to a natural entity that brought all these things in existence. I'm saying that when I look at the world, that is what I see. And the other thing that you mentioned was I used a design argument. I would have to show that these things could not exist if the Christian God did not exist.
Yeah, you'd have to show that like there's no other possible way they could exist without being designed by the Christian God.
I think that the answer to the first question would be how I would answer the second question. That as I look at the world, it points to the Christian God, and without the Christian God, none of these things would exist. And what we look at in existence includes order and disorder, and the order can be seen as being designed, and therefore will point to the Christian God.
Yeah, so here's what I would say. I think there are 2 points. And yeah, so the first point is you said like the Christian God has a certain like property set and only he has that. Yeah, we can accept that. And you said that though the properties of the Christian God and whatnot, they are sufficient to explain everything in terms of its design or whatnot.
Well, in terms of its grounding, in terms of its
but like showing that it's sufficient actually isn't enough, remember, because the first premise is not just that it's sufficient, but that it's necessary for these objects to exist. So merely showing it's sufficient, even if that's true, let's say it is true, that's not enough to actually show that it's necessary. Right. So let me give you an example.
When I use the word sufficient, Ark, how do you say your name?
Yeah, you can just say Ark. Ark is fine.
Okay, Ark. When I say sufficient, I meant sufficient for me, not sufficient for everyone. Because
but even if that's true, but like
as you probably well know, proof is not persuasion. I could give you reasons why I believe the way I believe or why I believe what I believe, but it's not conclusive and it's not persuasion. So go ahead.
But I'm saying like even if you say that, hey, this is like, hey, and that's fair. This is a sufficient explanation for me. This makes sense to me. Even if that's all true, that's not enough to show that he in fact is the necessary condition for objects existing, even if it's like a sufficient and an explanation that makes sense to you. That's still, and I'm fine with granting that, but that is still not enough to show that the first premise is true.
It's enough for me.
Okay, so would you be willing to say something like that convinces you, but like you don't have like an argument that that is convincing to anyone else or something like?
No, I'm not willing to say that. I'm willing to say that those who reject that argument have no identifiable unifying causal principle to trump what I said is the unifying causal principle.
Yeah, well, so I guess one point about the unifying causal principle, which is basically supposed to be, if anyone's not following, a unifying causal principle is kind of like an entity or a substance or a force that like grounds all of reality. Is kind of what it means.
A transcendental entity that grounds all of human existence in the natural world and the transcendental world. But again, you and I would say, and no one else has an identifiable causal principle to say that you're wrong, Adrian, and this is what it actually.
Yeah, that's fair. So I would say like about the unified causal principle, I would say first of all, like it might like, so you're saying like, well, maybe other people just don't have something like this. But one thing is that somebody might just deny that. Maybe they say, I don't think there is such a thing, nor do I think there needs to be such a thing. And then furthermore, next about like this whole idea related to the first premise. Yeah, I'm happy. Like, I'm not going to deny that maybe you think this makes sense to you. Like, of course, like, yeah, different things make sense to different people. In what might make sense to you might be like absurd to somebody else. That's all fine and good. But ultimately, like, that still just isn't a good argument for all you're saying in a sense is that, hey, this just makes sense to me. But I'm just going to say, well, hold on, even if it makes sense to you, I still want to know why should I think there's a good reason to think premise one is true, you know?
Yeah, I gave you the reason. I gave you the reasons that I think are good reasons as to why premise one is true, that in order for the world to exist, God must exist because God is a precondition for the world's existence. I gave you the reasons that I think are good for believing that, but I made sure that I identified and ascertained if you had a identifiable, defensible, unifying causal principle, which you said that you don't. And you're probably one of those people who say that you don't know what it is and you don't think that you need one. And I always say to people like that, we can walk away from the conversation agreeing to disagree. And I think that we need one. You don't think that we need one. It's not something that we should, unalive each other over. It's just something that I'm saying, this is my argument, and these are the reasons why I think that the opposition or the alternative doesn't make any sense, and so on and so forth. Because, I mean, in my worldview, if I were to say that there is nothing there, or I don't know what it is, or we don't need anything, those are all similar to saying there is nothing there. And if nothing is there, then I would find it very hard to believe, personally. I find it very hard to believe that everything we see in the world as it exemplifies itself to us came from nothing. I find it hard to believe. But if you believe that, it's fine.
Yeah, I'll say one more thing, and of course, I will make sure you have the last word here, since you're and all. But so I guess a few things about the unifying causal principle. Yeah, I don't think there is one, and I don't even think there's any reason. I don't think there's any good reason to think there is one or anything like that. Or I don't. It's not like there is one and I don't know what it is. I just don't think there is something like that. And then as for my issues with P1, I'll just make sure my issues with your kind of demonstrations are, you gave a design argument. First, I actually don't think the design argument is successful, but even if it was, all that would show is that there was a designer of the universe. It wouldn't show necessarily that the Christian God is the designer, and it wouldn't show that the objects couldn't exist possibly without the Christian God designing them. And then lastly, just one comment about what you said later, I don't hold the view that everything came from nothing or anything like that. I don't hold that position. But yeah, I actually think we did have a good conversation. So you can have the last word.
Very quickly. I'm sorry, because that was my conclusion about what you said. That since you said you don't think that there is a identifiable unifying causal principle, I took that to mean that you think we came from nothing. But you just said we don't come from nothing. So my conclusion about what you said was wrong. Can you help me to understand why it was wrong?
Yeah. So I don't think so. So my understanding of everything came from nothing, that would be something like there was nothing, then somehow like the universe just like popped into existence or something. So that's my understanding. I don't hold that view, and merely denying that there's some ultimate ground of reality, if you deny that, it doesn't actually commit you to saying that the universe popped out of nothing. So here are some alternatives. It could be the case that the universe is in some sense eternal, and so it didn't pop out of nothing per se. It's just always been there. Right? That's another possibility, something like that.
Okay, so when you make the statement, you don't think that there is an identifiable unifying causal principle that grounds the existence of reality. When you say you don't think there is something, that does not entail that you think the universe came into being from nothing.
Yes, exactly.
Bro, that's very... Can you see why someone would think that that is what you're saying?
I think so. Yeah, I think I could see why somebody would have that interpretation. But then, so I think then it becomes, then it becomes something for me to do to clarify why that entailment doesn't follow. And I think hopefully I have done that.
Yeah, and one of the things that you said was that you pointed out some possibilities as to why the universe could exist without this unifying causal principle. And one of those things you said would be that the universe is eternal. But,
yeah, so the universe might be eternal without some unified thing that like grounds all of reality.
But you would agree with me that it is almost, well, it is accepted on the majority, by the majority, that the universe is not static. It is expanding and therefore can't be eternal.
So it is accepted in the sense of physics. I'm willing to say maybe like it is our current, like the lambda CDM model holds that the universe is finite, but like I think there's actually there's like an equivocal sense of universe there. So there's universe understood in physics, and then there's universe like the philosophical idea of the universe, which you could think of like all of reality or something like that.
So you take a philosophical position, not a scientific position, on the eternality of the universe.
Well, I don't think when we talk about universe in that sense, it's not a scientific question. It's a philosophical question, because we're not talking about like this. We're not talking about universe qual like it would be used in physics. We're talking about universe as like all of reality or something, which is not a scientific idea. It's a philosophical.
So just to be clear, this is a clarifying question.
Yeah.
Your position on the there's nothing there that is identifiable as a unifying causal principle, but the universe is possibly eternal. That is a philosophical position that you have.
Absolutely. That is not a science. There is no scientific theory or experiment that tells. That's a completely philosophical view.
And let me say this: my position is also a philosophical position, which you probably know. Yeah. So both of us have differing philosophical positions, and I'm glad that you and I can walk away from this conversation respecting each other, and we had a good convo.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, nice. Well, I guess I jump down then. Yeah, keep well. Nice convo.
You too, man. Have a good one, Ark. Awesome. Yeah, I had to ask him that because I thought that he was coming from a scientific foundational framework as to why he thinks the universe is eternal, because most of what I've read on the matter points to the universe being finite and not eternal. So I was wondering, if he probably was aware of something that I wasn't aware of. But I'm glad that he pointed out that he is coming from a philosophical position as to why he thinks there is no identifiable unifying causal principle that grounds existence and reality. And that's what I think. I think that we do have something, and I think that we do need something, and that something is the God of Christianity, which is a philosophical argument and a philosophical position. But if his alternative is also a philosophical position, I mean, what am I going to say? I'm not going to bite his head off or condemn him or, call him stupid or dumb. I'm going to say, hey, we both have philosophical positions, and we both have our devotion to these philosophical positions. And, we can walk away from this conversation respecting each other, and both of us can think each other is wrong. I think he's wrong, and he thinks I'm wrong, and we can walk away from the conversation agreeing to disagree and still being respectful. But, that was a very interesting conversation. I never heard anyone say that they don't think there is an ultimate identifiable unifying causal principle that actualizes, sustains, and controls existence. He doesn't think that there is one, but he thinks that the universe does not then mean, or rather, he does not think that this entails that the universe came from nothing. He rather thinks the universe is eternal. And in that sense, he could say that he does not need a unifying causal principle. And I can agree. If the universe is eternal, then we don't need a unifying causal principle. But the universe is not eternal, so we do need a unifying causal principle, and I'm glad that we had a good convo. All right. Okay, so I probably think I'm going to have to make number 1 on the prompt a little bit more informative, probably. But that's what I often hear. I often hear, I mean, guys, yo, that was a good convo, because I thought that when he said he does not think there is an ultimate identifiable unifying causal principle, that he was saying the universe came from nothing. Because if there's nothing there to ground the universe, then that would entail the universe came from nothing. But he said that that's not what he's saying. And he explained that the reason why that's not what he's saying is because there's a possibility the universe is eternal. And I'm glad he cleared that up. And then I'm like, but wait a minute. Is that a scientific argument? Is that scientifically based? He's like, no, it's a philosophical argument. I'm like, okay, fine. We are both, coming from a philosophical argument and perspective on this particular issue. It's great.